Next slide. Okay, this is a summary and actually poster of the various deliverables and goals and what have you. I'm going to dive into each of the deliverables separately and also dive a little more into the findings with a little more detail. So this is just an overall synopsis. Next slide. Okay, the first deliverable we had was to look at metadata schema harmonization. This is an idealized diagram of what we were, or what we did, or partially did. And that's, on one hand, convert the XML schema for the dbGaP studies into OWL, and at the same time convert the BioCaddy that was being published in JSON schemas into OWL as well, and then use the 11179 infrastructure to harmonize the two different models to find the similar data elements, and ideally publish a JSON LD model that, when applied to dbGaP, produces BioCaddy output. Next slide. Okay. The dbGaP to OWL side, we wrote an XML schema to OWL conversion. It was focused on the various idioms of XML schema that were used in dbGaP, although it could be generalized. And one of the questions one has to ask is, there are other XML schema to OWL converters. Why did we create a new one versus just doing an existing conversion? And it's because our goal is not just to produce some OWL that represents the dbGaP model. It's to produce OWL that we can actually align with the ISO 11179 model. In particular, the OWL data type properties become data elements and restrictions become value domains. And I did mention we've hit a interesting nuance deep inside OWL that I wasn't aware of, and that's that you can't actually, it's not legal to name OWL restrictions. They have to be vnodes, which is curious. Next slide. On the BioCaddy to OWL side, it was a JSON schema source, and this was an interesting challenge because JSON schema is still evolving. There's a lot of different ways to do the same thing, and it is really obvious always what the spec means. We originally worked on JSON schema directly to OWL, but as we needed a JSON LD model of BioCaddy anyway, we switched over to doing JSON schema to JSON LD, and we have a converter that again handles the BioCaddy use of JSON schema. It would be an ambitious job to cover all of the possible nuances in JSON schema. And then it's a relatively straightforward manner to transform a reasonable JSON LD into OWL. So that one is, as I say, in the alpha stage. We really need to do some polishing and getting the tooling submitted. Next slide. So this is just a diagram of the dbGaP XML schema, just a sample here of the data set. Next slide. And this is the equivalent in the OWL model. This has not yet been connected to the ISO 11179, but this is just a standalone OWL model. Next slide. Okay, before we charge on, one of the things that's kind of important, and it's a mistake that I made early on, and it's an easy mistake to make. And when you have a schema, you can indeed get an OWL ontology out of it. But what the OWL ontology is talking about is the data elements in the schema itself. The OWL ontology is not talking about what the schema is documenting. I mean, it has to align with what the schema is documenting. And so In this case, when we convert XML schema and JSON schema into OWL, what we're doing is describing biomedical data records. We're talking about data elements and relationships. Now, what's interesting then is that when we talk about an upper-level ontology, if you're building an upper-level ontology for a model of medicine, you might look at Biotop or BFO or others out there. Since we're talking about data elements, we're really looking for an upper-level ontology about data. And it turns out that the ISO 11179 OWL model works pretty well. Our work was done with one that came from the XMDR group. Just fortuitously, I guess, as we were working on it, the NSA, whom funded a lot of the original 11179 work, decided to release their OWL model, and it's actually going to be published. So we can actually align with the model that's going to be used in the ISO standard. Next slide. This is just a diagram from it's the four-corner diagram from ISO 11179. The upper half of the diagram, the conceptual domain and data element concept, being the ontological or conceptual space, and the lower half being the information space. And one of the things ISO 11179 does is describe how one can link information to a conceptual model. If we start using this as an upper-level ontology, next slide, we can create instances of data element concepts. Data element concepts, its idea is to take an object class, which typically would be things like an object class might be a person, and a property might be hair color or birth date or height or any of a different variety of things, a collection of properties associated with object classes. Well, in our case, we are actually talking about data records. So we end up with a data element concept that could be, for instance, data set creation date. And that's an attribute of a data set in our universe of discourse with a property of creation date. And then when we go down to the representation side of the model, we can have a dbGaP creation, data set creation date, which is a data element that couples the data set creation data on one side with, next slide, a restriction, in this case, because we're dealing with OWL, a property called creation date that has a data type, which is the range of the restriction, which is an ISO date. So, and you'll notice that little restriction, that's actually a snippet of Turtle, and it's a B-node. What we really want to be able to do actually is to name that B-node, and we're working with some of the OWL folks to figure out how to do that, because we want to say that this restriction is also a value domain, and that's tricky to do when it's just a B-node. Next slide. And then finally, we end up with the going around the corner, which is the conceptual domain. What goes there, I'm not sure at this point. We have to work with the ontologies. I just picked a random, or something along that line, which is a record existence start point or something with a dimensionality point in time which lines up with date. So this is kind of how these are turning out to be creation date, gap creation date, the restriction, existence start point are all instances of what's represented in the 11179 meta model. Next slide. What we looked at, although we didn't have resources to do it on this grant, is starting with Ochre and let's see, what's the ontology for clinical research elements or research something or other. um, as part of the ontology for the data set information. Over on the right-hand side, again, it's even fuzzier whether we're going to use BFO2, which has gotten into the notion of assertions and documents versus just pure reality. Some of the connections might actually be into some of the data elements in ISO 21090. But anyway, those are next steps. Next slide. One note I wanted to make is when it came to aligning the BioCaddy schema, it was just interesting. I grabbed creation date as a random sample from dbGaP. If we go into the BioCaddy schema, their data set has an array called date info, and if you look at the description of date info, it's a set of date type pairs. So actually, at the moment, and again, this is dated March 24th. I know a lot has happened on the BioCaddy schema since then, and I haven't been tracking it. But as of March 24th, there was no direct notion of a creation date that we could line up with dbGaP, only indirectly in the sense that we would have to specialize this date reference schema and name a particular type that specified creation date. So that's just an interesting issue we had. Next slide. Right. It's not explicit. The schema just says you can have many dates. And in general, I mean, this is just a random sample, but the level of detail. And there's some interesting work that needs to be done when you get down into instance data. Next slide. So the status is we have XML schema to OWL. We have a prototype for JSON schema to JSON LD and a prototype JSON LT to OWL. Let's see, prototype tooling available for 11179. Oh, OWL to. Interesting question on what I'm trying to say there. That's 11179 compliant OWL to JSON LD. Our long-term goal is actually to be able to align the models and then create JSON LD definitions of the transformations, which leads to deliverable 2. Next slide. Deliverable 2 is a notion, once we've got these things aligned, then we looked at, can we use the JSON LD that we generated to take instances of the dbGaP schema and instances of the BioCaddy data and use JSON LD to align the two of them to turn dbGaP into BioCaddy submissions and go from there. Next slide. When we started trying to use JSON LD, one of the things we looked at, and we'll talk about that a bit more later, is the notion of actually publishing a biocaddy.schema.org, .schema.org for BioCaddy, something to think about. One of the things we did that became fairly clear is while JSON LD allows you to change tags and do a limited changing of types on RDF data records, there's nothing in JSON LD that allows you to do structural transformations to take, for instance, creation date and to split it into a field and a tag with a creation value on it. There's also an issue of nested tags. JSON LD assumes that the same tag in JSON has the same meaning throughout the context, and it's a real challenge if you've got a tag that is name for person name on one level and name for test name on another level. So what we concluded is that we need something more powerful. In the short term, we just use some Python script. In the longer term, we're looking at the shape expressions mapping as a way to get there. Next slide. So we have a prototype in place, and we've looked at checks and JSON LD. One of the advantages of checks and JSON LD is not only does it do the transformation, but it also works well on the documentation. I'll show a bit more of that at the end if we have time. Next slide. Okay. This was an interesting one. While one of the possibilities was BioCaddy, what we decided to do is to take the fire profile definitions and the fire metadata, fast healthcare interoperability resources. It's the thing that's kind of taken the healthcare domain by storm. And we wanted to look at what would it look like in schema.org, and how could it be used. So we created a transformation that took the fire definitions, they have their own meta language and associated metadata, and published a schema.org rendering of what was inside it, with the intent of being able to map it to what's in the Health Life Sciences and schema.org. Next slide. This is just a sample of the home page. Actually, I'm looking up there, noticing that the URL is local. We need to get it's actually out on the network there, and so we'll send that out later on for folks to look at it. But it looks like schema.org. It's published on our own site at the moment, and it's for investigation and comment. Next slide. And so this is just a sample entry of the fire resource called Observation. It's got body, site, category, code, etc. Different ways to look at it, so you can actually view what's in there. Since one of the native outputs of fire.schema.org is JSON-LD, you can use it to mark up all sorts of, well, it's designed particularly for marking up HTML, either through microformats, RDFA, or they've started incorporating JSON-LD as well. Next slide. So that's been published. We've showed it to elements of the fire community, and there's been a fair amount of interest and some interesting concerns about it as well. And I think some of the valid questions are what are the use cases? Why should this be out here? Why should we be marking up HTML with fire? So a couple of use cases we're going to publish. One is when you ship an instance of fire data, one of the requirements is that you have an HTML rendering of the information for human readability. We're going to look at using the JSON-LD coming from fireschema.org to mark up the HTML. A second use case is to take some health app, like something that runs on a phone that, let's say, records heart rate or something else, and see whether it makes sense to mark up the resulting information coming out with fire to add the information semantics. The other thing we need to do is, as we showed earlier, the health and medical types there. Fire.schema.org is clearly descriptions of information, just like the OWL we were talking about earlier. Schema.org and the Healthcare Life Sciences schema.org is information, or is descriptions about what the information is about, so there's some mapping work to be done there. Next slide. Right. And the shape expressions in fire, we talked about actually validating the work here. We're now publishing shape expressions as part of the fire standard for trial use 3. And we've been using a validation tool to actually validate the RDF instances that come out. Next slide. So this is a sample of something off of the fire website. This is the diagnostic report resource. There's now a little button over there, and the URL's on top that you can click. Next slide. That takes you to the shape expressions, the W3C shape expressions description of what goes into a diagnostic report. Next slide. And if you take an example, this is a sample that we just pulled off of the fire website. That should say RDF validator. I guess I missed putting that in the middle. And the diagnostic, the shape expressions, put it into the RDF validator. You can get a report that says, yes, this is a valid instance, or if it isn't, why not? Next slide. So, as a summary, the XML schema and JSON schema to the OWL model is doable, although to be sensible, we actually have to start adding the ontology mapping component into it. We have a proof of concept to JSON-LD. Data-driven transforms are possible in JSON-LD if you add in additional tooling. The FHIR to schema.org and as a analog, the BioCaddy to schema.org is doable, and we have a JSON-LD to the 111.7L is prototyped. And I don't know where to go, but FHIR could present a meta model for phenotype and study data. In fact, one of the things we're looking at now is extending some of the FHIR resources, particularly for cancer studies. And that's it.
So, in terms of integrate this pilot project with the prototype, do you have any suggestion? What are the possible ways to integrate it to the DataMed searching?
Well, one of the early next steps is to revisit the BioCaddy schema. I believe that has stabilized quite a bit, and I'm really interested in understanding it, exactly how the BioCaddy schema relates to the BioCaddy resource, because when we were trying to work with them, it was kind of like the schema was separate from the actual BioCaddy tooling. So that's one aspect we need to look at, whether the BioCaddy schema should become the canonical definition for what goes into BioCaddy.
When you say BioCaddy schema, you're talking about the metadata, the core metadata, right?
Right, the working group 3.
Yeah, we recently have a big kind of major change. We now compare with the DATS version 2, and it will be finalized soon, quickly.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, like, if this schema is very different from the previous BioCaddy schema, then on your side, how much work it is to actually remapping to this new BioCaddy schema?
Well, where we sit right now is just the tooling in place to initiate the mapping. So we're able to consume BioCaddy schema and produce JSON-LD and have a prototype in place, although there's some additional work we need to do to get it really robust, to take the resulting JSON-LD and turn it into to OWL for that. So that gives us the mapping resources we need, the BioCaddy OWL, and then the BioCaddy 11179 OWL. And then we can take other resources such as dbGaP, TCGA, and I don't remember, there's some others we were looking at there that we can pull in and actually start making assertions about the mappings.
Yeah, I think previously we had some discussion whether BioCaddy application has some capability to accept submission of data sets that's compliant with BioCaddy metadata schema.
Yeah, that's what Hua was discussing, is that we've been going through various revisions of the metadata schema, and so that's what's being planned for this this latest revision.
Okay. So what's the estimated date for stability? How do we recognize? Is it to the point that it's reasonably solid?
I'm actually going to discuss the
today.
DATS schema today, later. Maybe you guys should stay on the phone call and we can discuss this. my understanding is we're going to finalize it very soon. That's why we want to discuss this as soon as possible.
So Philippe, do you have a timeline?
Well, I guess the timeline is as soon as possible, and in a way, I very much would like to echo what Harold just said about clarifying which component actually really use the schema, but also we need to hear back from the group that have been in a way using the schema to things where things are actually catching, where things could be simplified or streamlined. And in that attempt, we reviewed a lot of the transformations that have been posted by Jeff and Hua's group on the data pipeline from BioCaddy, just to see the kind of regularity that we could have in when we harvest data from various sources. One of the key issues in my eye would be to ensure that the same information is really represented in the same way, even though I have to admit that the BioCaddy schema allows some wiggle to occur, and there will be some polymorphism, but we need to precisely somehow curate those transformations to make sure that we have a common understanding of how to best use the objects. And as Harold pointed, some of the current aspects of the schema in JSON schema for the BioCaddy do not necessarily mandate strictly terminology, and this is somehow delegated to an external resource. And to that effect, I also have a number of questions. I mean, one of the main feedback we had during the DATS meeting in June in San Diego was the fact that people were confused by data type, in the sense that they didn't know what exactly this encompasses, and we need to clarify this aspect. So yes, all these points need to be discussed and very soon. But I don't expect the overall schema to change. It will be more refinement, maybe slight refactoring and clarification of the terminology that would be needed to support really well some of the queries, which in itself also brings a lot of issues because we need to automate this kind of matching of terms to be able to do that automatically without having to rely on human intervention, or at least to limit as much as we can human action.
Cool. So before we move to the discussion for the DATS, I actually still want to try to identify like this pilot project, how we can integrate this with the prototype. Jeff, do you think this is kind of the tool, the deliverables they make, is primarily going to help with the data ingestion process, or it will sort of helping the search process? I'm still not quite.
Well, I mean the sort of the DATS import will help with the data ingestion, right? So that's if we have people submitting DATS, and we don't have to really, as Philippe said, we don't really have to have any curation, right? It's in the form that we ingest it in, and we know what to do with it. But I think with this model, because they have richer information, I mean that really gets to then sort of the searching across the data set in terms of the richer information that they're bringing in, to the data set.
But are we searching those information right now? Or because for example, the dbGaP example, they will actually have a lot of variables, which is about the measurement, blood pressure, things like that, all those things. But when we search, we actually didn't go deep to that kind of variable level search. So
yeah, I remember that issue. We talked to you.
I'm trying to figure out a way how we can actually use this deep information.
Well, because you're going to want to, I mean, for data sets that have the variable information, and you are going to want to search across that because people might be searching for specific types of measures.
Yeah, and one of the things on some of the data sets you're going to face is it's going to be a lot of tag value pairs, just like whether it's still the case in BioCaddy, but
the issue is right now for the metadata we have about data set, we don't even go to the level of variables. We don't store them, do we?
For certain data sets, we do have certain deeper information. Not for all.
But technically, for the case of dbGaP, because we looked at it for another project, and it would be, I think, a very valuable resource to be able to index on some of these variables for discovery purpose.
Yeah. But yeah. So currently, for the current DATS BioCaddy schema, will we be able to store all those detailed information about it, such as variables?
Well, we model it so that we think it's possible, and this is why we have got a dimension object somehow, and we expect it to be able precisely to store this type of information. Because
some
these
of the data sets already have dimension, have some
correct.
dimension elements, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is the way George Alter and his group at Michigan have coded the information they are indexing. So that was really a nice work they did.
Okay, maybe we should go to the next discussion so we can learn more about what's in the metadata model now.
Yeah, I mean, Juan, this gets to the whole, because for the last couple months we've sort of been working on the new DATs and some of the enhancers which we actually. The NLP enhancer that Ergen developed, Barak last week actually integrated that, so that's being tested right now. So we've sort of been, over the last month, sort of bringing this all together for the new DATs and for these enhanced documents. And so, we're sort of right on the verge of pushing, this new sort of standardized data with, additional information out.
Okay.
And that's sort of, I think, the key because, hopefully, as Philippe said, the core DATs, because we've had a number back and forth even with the core elements, but that seems to have settled, and there are a couple core elements that your group needs, sort of like the release date. There's a minimal list of like 4 or 5 elements that we need to make sure every repository has, even if they don't have it. We need to make sure that the element is there. So that the UI can take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Right.
So that will all be with the new data release. So that the core. So this question to Philippe. The question is, when we start sort of ramping up, data sets to push through, if we have some that only have some of the minimal metadata, we need to be pretty darn sure that we're not going to change that core, sort of like the elemental core, because if we do, then it becomes even more work to then have people to have to go back and continually change things.
Yeah, my understanding was once we finalize the core, same thing as the development of or evolution of the ontology. You create that kind of concept, you don't really simply delete them. You always kind of have them create new concept. It's sort of never delete existing concepts.
Right, and renaming them is okay, but if there's any, but I think we're at the core level, it's going to be very stable with this new release, so we should be fine with that. Because that's my only concern is that we don't want to start shifting. We sort of all need to come to agreement that yes, this core is going to be stable for the next 6 months, so we can all work with it.
Yeah.
Jeff, do you have a timeline for the release?
So we got the NLP pipeline ingested or integrated. Barak finished integration end of last week, and he's testing it right now. So just should be very close to being able to roll to roll this new data out, and that syncs with developments happening on the UT's side, because they also have the new UI components they've been developing, right? So there's sort of the data is going to be merging with your new release on your side, right, Hua?
Mm-hmm. You talking about searching the new additional fields from the I didn't expect.
Well, because you have to use. There's some of the standard core fields, like the clinical trial data, the data availability field and things like that, which play into the UI.
Yeah.
So for the clinical trials, they're going to have a field which will tell if there's associated data available or not.
Yeah.
And if we have that, then we search it.
Yeah, I know that, but that's not something.
No, but I don't think we'll have much changes on the UI per se.
Yeah.
Well, but there's the incorporation of the NLP, and so I don't know which version that's going into on your end. That's if you're going to search those fields on this release or the next. That's something we can talk about.
Yeah, we probably still.
But the data will be there
on the NLP. Search the NLP outputs.
So Jeff, I think for the NLP part, we were actually talking about it getting released in version 2 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right, let's go back to the schedule. I'll get back to move forward.
I think the critical thing is that these enhancements are then in the data, so that you can do what you need to do on the UI side. So if the NLP stuff gets integrated a bit later, because we have to do test the integration that we're doing now, and then release the data with that integrated.
Yeah, I think
on our end.
On our side is just to include those fields in the indexing so we can search for.
Right.
I think the order we probably is one is trying to finalize the DATS. That's why Philippe today we want to make sure we all discuss it. Then on your team trying to finalize how the mapping, the data ingestion to this sort of finalize the DATS version. Then on our side, we'll see if there's additional field we need to index and search. But I think actually not a very big deal for us to add a few fields for the searching. But if we want to search deep on, say, variables from dbGaP, that part maybe we actually need to think more about how we're going to do that. Yeah.
Right. One option is to always. If you're looking for, if these are sort of tag keywords, you can also add a lower weighted all query in Elasticsearch to your search, so that it will pull records if they are in sets of deeper fields, so you don't have to do queries against all the potential fields that it might be in. That's something we can.
Yeah, we can
discuss
about that. Yeah, once we get to that point. The other thing I actually just also mentioned to Jeff on the email, we're also thinking about, just like Jeff mentioned, maybe we may not mapping all the field to the metadata yet, but there's maybe a few key fields which is used for the search engine, like the date, the title, the description, that can be actually easily mapped to the metadata, or with minimal effort. And once those there, we actually can search those data sets. So maybe initially we have 30, 50 fields to map to the standard metadata, but now we could only focus those 5, very easily map those 5, very straightforward. Then those are what we call a partially matched data repository data sets. And by include those partially matched, we actually can include those into the search engine. So by doing that, we may be able to quickly expand into 50 repositories which are searchable, but maybe not all their metadata was mapped to the standard yet. So sort of the concept of partially matched data repository. So in that case, on our website, we will see two type of data set. One is completely normalized to the metadata standard. The other could be partially matched. We still have teams in the back end manually ensure the quality of all other fields. But those core fields like title, abstract description is already mapped and searchable. So this way we think maybe we can quickly expand the data report from whatever we have 24 to something like 50 or even more. So it looks like more significant.
Yeah, that's why the core DATS is key to be stable. Because otherwise there's a lot of shuffling then if it's not. So I mean, I guess then the key thing is to get to Philippe, right, about DATS.
Yeah, let's talk about that. And do you want to switch to Philippe?
Philippe, do you have something you want to present, or you just want me to pull up the GitHub repository information?
Well, I could share my screen if it's possible at all, briefly to show, hopefully, some of the point of discussion that we still have. So
I just promoted you. Did you get something from?
Okay, I've got ReadyTalk that gives me the control. So hopefully I'll be able to share. Alternatively, I could send you the link to the. Bear with me. So ReadyTalk is installing. Okay, yeah. So
you should be able to share your screen.
yeah. So let me know if you can see the screen, the Read the Doc page.
We can see the screen, but we cannot read the doc.
Okay.
Might have to zoom in.
Is that any better? No, not really. So I produced a Read the Doc documentation for the BioCaddy DATS, which hopefully will make documentation more straightforward to access and navigate. But so one of the issues that we have at the moment is the documentation of the data set provenance. So to include in all the transformation that we do for any given repository, to have an explicit information about what is the source of information, whether it's the actual data files served from the archive, or whether it's a SOAP or REST API feed, or if it's another source of information, so that this can be clearly documented, and we would have a completely transparent link to the mapping between that feed, that source of information, and that elements which have been used. So that's one thing. I know that Jeff is working on providing me that list, so we should be able to document that information, so that anything about the provenance of the source of information is included into the JSON document that is produced by the transformation. But I think
so Philippe, I mean, what we discussed before was that the information is basically going to be sort of the endpoint that we're targeting and the type of interaction. So if we're getting it over sort of web service, or if we're doing an FTP of the data,
Correct.
and the location where they're coming from, and then
Yes.
the date. And so that was just to make sure that was the core information for that you needed.
Right. No, that's correct. And a corollary of that aspect is that depending on the nature of the repository or the source of information, the transformation may use strictly the DATS core, or may also use the DAT extended model, and which will produce a specific metadata profile, just because the underlying data would require a bit richer transformation. So the typical example I have in mind is that if we are targeting UniProt data sets, for instance, where the records are a record of information about a protein and peptides, which are facts by knowledge about those entities, it's obviously inherently different from a data set served by the Short Read Archive or the Array Express repository in Europe, or the GeoData sets, which are experiment sets of samples which are assayed with a particular technique, which produce data files and data matrices. And here we need to probably expose a bit more or use different objects which are supplied by the extended DATS model. So that's, again, we would be able to classify the various transformations and have more specifically geared or dedicated set of transformations, even though they would share obviously the DATS core, which would be the unifying element between all these repositories. But going back to the issue that we had, I hope you can see some of the diagram may be a bit small. I can try to actually share it with that. So bear with me a moment. I will go back to the DATS and share another application, which is the CMAP. And let me know if you can see that diagram a bit better. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes. Much better.
Yes. So I think one of the main issue that we faced during the last June meeting, as I mentioned, was that when we described the data set and we linked to a qualifier which is called data type, people were a bit confused about what is that we're talking about. So I tried to break down a little bit more what could be in a way covered by the elements here. So the key critical element is, of course, the content type. What is the data set about, and what kind of information it contains. One aspect is, okay, you could use the MIME type that can be a source of information to regularize the categorization of information, and this is well documented, so we can refer to the MIME type documentation for that. But we could also rely on a different set of vocabularies, as the one used by SciCrunch, for instance, or NIF repository or BioSharing, just to give a few examples. And this, as I feel, we would need to somehow agree to that conventions, so that's, again, we improve the search capability on the Datamed side.
Philippe, can I make a comment here? I think you might have just confused people by referring to the MIME type, because what you're pointing to on the left side of the diagram is the content qualifier, is a very high level, is a sort of high level content type. But if MIME type actually appears not as an attribute of data set, but as an attribute of data distribution. So if you go to the right side of your diagram, in the middle there's something called a format descriptor, and
Correct.
and if it's off the screen to the right, but if you can scroll the whole thing to the left, people will see that the format descriptor includes MIME type and format as attributes. So I think it's important to distinguish between the really, what MIME type, which could be a file level attribute, and content type, which is a broader attribute of a whole data set.
That's a perfectly fair comment. I would add that, in fact, the MIME type could be used both at the level of the data distribution and at the level of the content qualifier, because in some cases, the content qualifier of a data set will include, okay, we need to talk about the cell files or the sequence files which are provided, and that therefore the part of the data set will have a content qualifier of type chemical for MIME type chemical for the sequence file, but it won't be the only I would say descriptor for the dataset data type. It will only be a part of it. So we need to be able to still qualify what the dataset is about. And again, I realize this can be introducing confusion. However, I wanted just to bring it up precisely to have that discussion as to exactly what would be we would need to cover, and which are the resources that we should tap into, so that we don't have necessarily to reinvent a lot of things.
Philip, I sort of trying to figure out, like, in the case of dbGaP, if we have those variable information about blood pressure, where it will go here?
Well, this would go in a different element, which is called the dimension. So let me, I will open another file. Excuse me. So I'm opening this one. So this the dimension element that you can see here that relates to the data set would be the one to use to describe all the kind of variable that we may have. And this, in a way, will be the things that we are recording about maybe a material or an entity that is a topic of the subject of the investigation of the study, and that it makes up a part of the data set, or can be measured through a data acquisition event or data analysis. So of course, you don't have to use necessarily the full complex model, but we can use the element of dimension that connects to the notion of data set to make this bridge and list all the elements. And we can define those dimensions with either whether they are quantitative or qualitative. So that's, I believe, is the right container for such thing. And to some extent, we wanted to validate that with examples such as dbGaP or the one that George has been working on very nicely, in fact.
So basically, this dimension could be anything about the study collecting the variables, right?
Right. Yes. Yes.
So that's good to know. 'Cause right now we're not searching all those dimension fields, right? So we need to think about later.
No.
Additional field we need to search. Right now we only search very limited fields. That's the
Yes, and in a way, this is why we wanted also to drive forward the documentation about how to use the data in which context, and maybe define those profiles, because the information from repository to the next may vary slightly, but we can still use these generic constructs to store the information. We just have to document the patterns and the preferred way to encode information. So the transformations can be more consistent across, which would give better recall on the datanet side of things. And before we can reach that, I wanted to discuss with the group. I know it's already late, but just to see if we can have this maybe another call next week to refine or just check on some of the positions that we are making. Not again. It's always the risk is to overcomplicate the model, and I don't want this to happen. However, we still need to guide the people to put information in the bin that is most naturally or most intuitive to have.
Mm-hmm. I think that we
So
can
for-
open in the meeting.
Yeah, no, for the follow-up call, I mean, would Thursday, like at, I guess, 6 p.m. your time, which is 9 a.m. Pacific, does that work?
Thursday?
Or yeah, I mean, this Thursday we can definitely have the first call.
Okay. You said 6 p.m.
It would be
here.
9 a.m. Pacific, I think, is 6 p.m. your time, or is it 5 p.m.? I always forget.
I think
Are you 9 or 8 hours ahead?
Yeah, 5 p.m. could be okay with me, yes.
So you're 8 hours ahead then?
Yes,
I always
yes,
forget.
8 hours
Is the
ahead.
one that always confuses me.
Yes, we are a bit outside.
Okay, so Ron, Anu, does that work for some people on your side as well?
Yes.
So that would be 11 a.m.
For half an hour, yeah.
And I guess, I mean, I really followed with a high interest the feedback from Harold, and that was really, really useful. So I guess that having this kind of examples in mind as well to see how best we can serve some of the, or correct some of the maybe the shortcomings on some aspects of the model would be highly helpful.
Yeah, it would be interesting to do a little more extensive mapping to see, start looking at the various aspects and see how it goes now that it's stabilizing.
Right. And maybe one thing I forgot to mention actually is depending on the source of information, so depending on which, for instance, if we take Short-Read Archive, for instance, if we tap into accessing the XML documents directly, or if we tap just only to on the REST interface to the basic page, the kind of information we can recover are obviously completely different, and also we can embed some of the some logic to calculate or compute some of the information that could be surfaced about. I'm thinking about the size or the number of samples in a given study. This is not the kind of information that is necessarily embedded information, but we can compute it and count it and surface this, which could be also useful for again, filtering the data sets in DataMed. And again, it will depend on the kind of the feed that we tap into.
We're over time.
We are over the time actually, but Ron wanted to briefly discuss.
I can be brief.
Yeah.
The first issue had to do with the technical paper or document that we asked for. I saw a couple of places where there were some manuscripts either in preparation or under review, and if that information is in one of those, Anu, could you please send it to me? If not, give me some sort of an update on the progress of putting together a technical document. And the second item has to do with prioritization of data sets, and I just want to give you a heads up that there are some activities going on in BD2K that will impact on BioCaddy with regard to data sets that the NIH would like to have prioritized for ingestion. And one of those is the so-called the TopMed data set, but we're not sure yet precisely which ones will be included. Some will probably come from the Common Fund folks, but I just want to give you an update, or a heads up actually, that some of these are going to be coming your way sooner rather than later.
Okay.
So that's all I have.
Ron, are these the ones that are coming in from the Commons, or are they?
They will be part of the Commons, and they include what are being referred to as reference data sets. And there's a separate group BD2K that's working on that. So really, it's I guess you'd call it generally referenced data sets, but within that will be large data sets coming from NIH Central, that is Francis Collins, and from the Common Fund. So just as a heads up, this will probably be coming to you in the near future.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
Good to
So
know.
Jeff, I remember we talked about the technical documents.
Yeah, so I've collated together the different, because some were on GitHub wikis and some in GitHub Markdown files, and so I've collated them into a Google Doc, and so I'll share that link. I'll send that link to you,
All right.
All right.
and then we can do a quick review of the docs and then send them.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
And then the
I'll send out the invitation for Thursday's meeting.
okay. And then we can push to next week. We can push the CEDAR template.
Yes. Also, we
I
are
have some
scheduled
slides
to
and I
meet
can
the CEDAR folks during our tech team call next week. So I
Okay.
thought that might be useful that when we are discussing the template that we have them on the call.
Okay. No, that sounds good.
All right.
And then the only other thing is that I had a call with the BRICS group this morning. So this was a follow-up from the workshop. So the BRICS group, that's Matt McAuliffe, and so they're developing the Traumatic Brain Injury Archive and others at NIH. And so they're trying to align their today was basically sort of the introductory call. So what they're doing is they're going to be aligning some of their internal metadata model to DATS. And so Philippe and Danu, I'll send an email out sort of linking everyone together.
Okay.
But they're looking to have their February/March release, or no, their March-April release next year to have their new metadata model. And one of the things that came out of that, which ties into the discussion earlier today, is that, you know, with the DATS core sort of stabilizing and then a number of groups now producing the DATS documents, what do we want to do in terms of specifying an API either for people to provide, for us to crawl the DATS, or an API on our side for them to push DATS? So that's the topic we should have on some future call. That's sort of the next step in this path, right? So we have the core metadata model, or the standardized metadata model. Then the next piece of that is, well, how do they get that metadata to us?
Jeff, can you spell that out? BRICS group. What exactly is that?
BRICS, BRICS, I believe so. It's Matt McAuliffe.
Okay.
And so he was the original developer for ENDAR, or
Right.
he led the original development for ENDAR, and now he's working on FitBur and a couple of other repositories. And he was at the metadata workshop
Right.
in La Jolla. And so what they're looking to do, they're retooling sort of their core study metadata model under the hood. And since we'd already been doing a lot of work on that with DATS, they figured that they'd, basically try to tie into that. And so, they're sort of currently planning their next, again, it's government, so they're planning their next release, which is next March, April. And so next month is when they're going to finalize the details of that release. So part of that is the, tying in with DATS. And we discussed potentially also having a face-to-face at the BD2K all-hands meeting just to sort of sit down with them
Okay.
at that point. So.
Okay, I think we're going to stop here today now. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.